and thank you everyone for joining us today. So as mentioned, my name is Amanda and I'm the Communications and Development Specialist at Cornerstone Counseling. If you run into any technical issues during today's presentation, please use the chat function to contact me directly, and then I can do my best to assist you. We will be recording today's session, but please note we are not keeping the chat. So if you see something that you want to save, just grab that from the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, and prosper is Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional meeting grounds and gathering place for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations, and we are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders. We recognize the land of an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and gather on today. So today we will be discussing anxiety, and we just want to share this disclaimer that this is a psychoeducational webinar and not therapy, nor is it a replacement for medical advice from your doctor. So just keep that in mind. However, these slides were developed by our two facilitators here. So the first facilitator is Alexandra, and she is a registered provisional psychologist at Cornerstone Counseling. She has been on our team since January 2021. So she's worked with adults, couples, and families who are struggling with various issues, including anxiety, depression, and trauma. One of the things she loves most about counseling is the privilege that comes through sitting with courageous individuals every day. So if you are interested in pursuing counseling with Alex, our agency's contact information will be at the end of this presentation, or you can always reach out to me or her in the chat. Our second presenter is Michelle Devlin, the owner of Creating People Power. She is a certified CMHA psychological health and safety advisor and is also DISC certified. She's an accomplished facilitator, passionate about fostering respectful workplaces and helping business professionals become better leaders. And Michelle and I have worked together since 2020, and it's been so lovely. So if any of you are interested in working with Michelle or improving your business or collaborating on various events, please contact her. She is fantastic to work with. And on that, Michelle and Alex, please take it away.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. I feel the same working with you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And since we are talking about feelings, I think this would be a great place to start and just get a sense to see how is everybody feeling today. So what we thought we'd do is just give you the opportunity to have this conversation here in Menti. So you can actually click on the link that I just put in. The code is, oh, maybe I should enter that so that people will see, 11067152. For those of you that are checking out our webinar live, if you're watching the recording, obviously you won't be able to participate. Alex, why don't you tell us how you are feeling today? We just had this conversation right before we popped in.
Yeah, I'm feeling super hopeful and optimistic. I think the switch in the weather has been so lovely and just nice to feel the sun on your face, nice to not have to wear a coat outside. So all of that taken together, I think feeling really good today. How are you feeling, Michelle?
I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed today, to be completely frank. I'm also feeling happy and optimistic and hopeful, though. So I feel like I have, this big, bowl of feelings. Like, I'm not sure if I can feel all these conflicting things at the same time. But that's kind of how I'm feeling.
I think that's
how about you?
Putting it.
Yeah, and I was just going to give Amanda the chance to share about how she's feeling.
I actually filled out the Mentimeter, and one of my words was springy. So I'm very excited about the nice weather and just having, the bright light, the new fresh spring atmosphere. So I'm feeling pretty good.
Nice. Okay, well, I'm going to share. So I should let everybody know that any of the responses you put into Mentimeter are completely anonymous. I know some of you really enjoy the chat and you feel confident in the chat, but we wanted to give people the opportunity to share their feelings in a completely anonymous venue. And this is something that we have clients do. We were just recently hosting webinars with the United Way, and we had conversation about how are people feeling and what are we doing at work. And someone had shared that they do this every day at work. So a one-word check-in, you don't have to describe it, you don't have to explain it. If you want to use the word crappy, tired, busy, you just do a check-in. Mentimeter is another way that you could do that at work. You could have everybody put how they're feeling. So we can see there's lots of different feelings. Alex, I'm assuming you're able to see that as well.
Yes.
Any thoughts about what you see in the word cloud?
Uncertain, unsettled. Lots of words that are definitely making me think about our conversation today, anxiety, that fit quite well. But it's interesting, just going back to what you were saying, Michelle, I think we can a lot of times feel some conflict or turmoil in terms of the different emotions that we're feeling. So maybe this morning on your way to work, you were having that adrenaline rush because of traffic and there was some anxiety coming up, but then you stepped out of your car and the sun hit your face and you were feeling very springy, as Amanda was. And so I think it's really good to see just the array of emotions that everyone is feeling, because we can feel all of those in one day.
I just noticed that the color is kind of hard to read for some of the words, and especially if you're on a little bit of a smaller screen. So thanks to the person who sent me that feedback. We'll make sure we change the color next time. Okay, let's keep going. So I'll pop back to the slide presentation. We talked about how we're feeling, and part of the reason we wanted to start with that is to just acknowledge and take a moment to accept how you're feeling. That sometimes we're going to be sad, sometimes we're going to be restless, sometimes we're going to be frustrated, and that may affect the way in which we show up at work, at home, with our friends, and with our loved ones. So we just want to take this acknowledgement, and sometimes that's really important piece of recognizing where we're at in terms of our emotions. Alex, I know we covered this last time, but I think it's important to just give a sense of really defining from your perspective, right, as a therapist, what is anxiety?
Good question. Well, here, of course, as you can see on the slide, we have probably the Merriam-Webster definition of anxiety. It is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something that will have an uncertain outcome. One thing that I always kind of bring into our conversation about anxiety is how it is actually quite a normal reaction to stress and can be both helpful and unhelpful at times. I kind of feel bad for anxiety. If it was a person, it's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of bad stereotypes about it. And of course, it can be really distressing for some individuals, but I definitely think one of the things that is explored, at least in therapy, and that could be reflected with our participants today is, how does anxiety show up for me? Is it a comfortable or relatively comfortable amount, or is there something going on that I may need to tweak the way I engage with it? One of the kind of examples that I share with clients sometimes is, imagine you are on a hike, walking through the woods, and you hear some rustling of leaves. You turn around and there's a bear. You don't want anxiety to be an emotion that you don't feel. It's very useful in that moment to sort of turn on your fight and flight system. However, the opposite could be you're walking through the woods and there's a little bird that's perched on a tree and you hear that rustle of leaves. And so every sound you hear, you're kind of, and you really cannot enjoy your hike. We want that very normal, and I guess normal may not even be the right word, but we want that sort of moderate experience of anxiety where it's helpful in the situations that we need it, but not so distressing or debilitating that it impacts our life in a negative way.
So, Alex, you mentioned the word impact, or the phrase impacting in a negative way, I wanted to ask you before we go on, is anxiety generally, I mean, I know there's a lot of stigma associated with it. Is it often associated with worry, or is it the same thing as worry? Because that's something that someone had asked, and I thought this might be a good place to make that distinction if there is one.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, worry and stress are characteristics of anxiety. We're going to talk a little more in our conversation about anxiety disorders very briefly and diagnosis. But I think they're all very similar. And if any of you had tuned into our last conversation on anxiety, it is very much on a spectrum where there might be sort of had a minor amount of stress and worry on one end, and it can sort of increase to very debilitating anxiety on the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of how I always like to use the 3Ds. Is it disruptive, debilitating, or distressing? And that can be a very good way of understanding what it looks like for ourselves.
I love the 3Ds and the fact that you referenced that. Maybe we'll pop that in the chat, because I think that is a really, really great acknowledgement. The spectrum was really helpful, and we got great feedback on that. So thanks for bringing that up as well, Alex. I don't know that we have it here, but I think this is an opportunity, and we can maybe share it with people after this webinar. This is a great opportunity, again, completely anonymous, for people to go into Mentimeter and just take a minute to really personally reflect, how does anxiety show up for you? So all of us at some point have experienced or will experience anxiety. So if you go into, you can use Menti again, or you can put in the chat, as some people are already doing, how does anxiety show up for you? And let me just share the slide. It's funny that we just had this conversation about, whether or not it's negative, because that's the image I associated with it. I don't generally tend to think of anxiety as something positive in my life. And I can give an example of how it shows up for me, because I'm having, I think, some anxiety about traveling next week. I've noticed that because there's still lots of restrictions around what we can and can't do, I've limited some of my social interactions, because I think I'm feeling a little anxious about, I don't want to get sick before traveling. And I see people are putting, distressing into the chat. And, it is absolutely changing the way in which I'm doing things over the last couple of weeks. So, for me, this conversation is really timely. Okay, so we are seeing some responses come in. How does anxiety show up for you? We are so thankful for your vulnerability and your willingness to be honest. I've got it up on the screen, and some of you might see this.
Wow. I don't know what's sticking out for you as you read these, Michelle, but I think I'm really getting a sense of the different ways anxiety shows up. For example, like the physical sort of manifestations, the psychological, very all-encompassing.
Yeah. I love that some people have that acknowledgement. As we can see, people feel physically sick. They get a tight chest. They might hyperventilate. There's feelings in your stomach. For me, it's in my neck. There's sleeplessness.
Ooh, yeah.
And look at this conversation about it. Someone said it freezes me. I can't focus, or cognitive freezing, inability to get out of this mental rut. Anything else standing out for you?
Yeah, I think the physical side of it, sometimes I've found we very easily can think about, I'm overthinking, I can't perceive a situation in the right way or straight, but a lot of times we don't recognize those smaller changes in our body, the tightness in chest, shaking, even increased sweating, rapid heartbeat. all of these things, and just how debilitating those can be in and of themselves. Yeah.
So once we recognize these symptoms, Alex, or these signs of anxiety, can we just talk right now about what do we do with this? So step one for everyone who's logging in, just to make it really easy, is right. We need to recognize this. We need to take a moment and recognize in our body, how is anxiety showing up? And now that we know it, right, we've got a tight chest, we're getting sweaty, we've got this excessive worry. Now that we have this awareness, Alex, what's the next step for us?
Good question. What do we do with it? It's easy to
Yeah.
talk about all of these things, but what's the next step? Well, I think people will get so tired of me using the word, how unique it shows up for everybody. But when I even think about what goes on for me, every time I start a webinar or workshop, I always feel a little bit of that tightness in my own chest. And so just because I might experience that doesn't mean I have to maybe act on what is going on in my body, right? And so why I bring up the uniqueness, if per se, this tightness was causing me to clam up, I wasn't able to speak when I do workshops, I had to leave workshops, I burst into tears, all of those things, those might be indications that maybe I need to go and talk to somebody about what is going on for me. Again, I'll sound like a broken record with those 3 Ds, but how much is those physical symptoms, emotional, psychological symptoms, how much are those impacting our quality of life and our day-to-day functioning? And so I guess, noticing all the different ways anxiety shows up for people, I think it's good to recognize that that is quite normal experience of anxiety. It's more so, how long do you feel that? How debilitating is it to your day-to-day life? Those are the types of questions.
Okay, great. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because you kind of struck a chord with me on the emotional piece. That's how it shows up for me. So when I get a little bit nervous, I know that I feel myself getting teary. And there was a point over the last few months where, even though I was dealing with grief and loss, as some of our listeners know, it was too much. Like, it was too many tears in one day. And it was becoming, to quote your D's, a little bit disruptive, which is when I went to seek medical help, because I'm like, okay, I don't think this is normal. Like, this isn't how I was functioning previously. And it was absolutely disruptive to my life. And it was also, I think, like, I don't know if I want to use this word, but it was noticeable to my family. I don't know if it was disruptive, but it does change the energy and vibe in our house. So I think that's why this webinar and this content became really personal for me, is because I've experienced it and I know what it's like. And Alex, we talked about this. What are you seeing? Let's talk about this as professionals. We had conversation about the fact that there's conversation on reports and we're seeing some extremes. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. One of the things when we bring up like statistics or how common is this experience, I think statistics are very limited, and they also only encompass those individuals that might have a formal diagnosis of anxiety. So statistics, I often try to shy away from, but just people's reporting of anxiety, especially, I'm going to say the terrible word of COVID during the last years. Yes,
yeah.
I'm all tired of it.
Yeah, I know.
But quite frankly, I think it's had a huge impact on anxiety and, of course, other mental health concerns at the same time. More and more people are coming in sharing anxiety. And I personally, I know our brains, the way they're biologically made, we don't have the ability and capacity to navigate such long-term stress, coming up against all of these uncertainties. You were even just saying for your traveling, Michelle, I mean, as much as the doors are opening on that, there is also some uncertainty around the changes that are coming. And so just even recognizing what we've had to go through over the last 2 years, I definitely think there has been an impact. and I don't know if I want to say extremes per se, but extreme in terms of an uptick in more and more people experiencing this from a wide range of populations. Yeah. What has been your experience, Michelle? What have you?
I'm totally hearing that as well. And I think what has happened with many people, at least for the people in my circle who we've talked about, is we're starting to develop strategies. So, for example, let me stay with the traveling strategy. I'm traveling with family. And I have kids that are over 18 now. So we've actually had conversation about options. So what if someone tests positive either before we leave? Do the rest of us go? Does that one person stay home, or do we all stay back? So we're trying to think ahead and develop some strategies so that we can kind of look at all the different scenarios and take away as much uncertainty or as much of the unknown as we possibly can, so that we can kind of move forward. It would be very similar, I think, to, you mentioned public speaking and preparing for a presentation. And these strategies can work like both at home, and also I want to tie them into a workplace, right? So for example, right now where we're hearing people are experiencing anxiety is returning into a physical workspace. Some people can't wait to come back into the office, and others are uncertain. So, I think that, right, these are all things that we just need to acknowledge and start talking about a little bit more openly, which on a positive note, I think we are seeing that, Alex. Like, you're seeing it and we're seeing it also in workplaces.
Absolutely. I love what you just said. I think it really does come back to being self-aware and knowing yourself. If you are feeling nervous about going into the office, as many people are, preparing for that. What might I do in the day then to mitigate that impact? Do I need to limit my social contact with colleagues? Do I need to step out for lunch? Do I need to call my husband or friend for just a pep talk in the middle? Trying to really buffer ourselves. That preparation can be very important.
Yeah. And I think the preparation piece is also important for anybody who's logging in today that has direct reports or a team, to be able to have conversation and check-ins with everybody. And, more than one check-in. Like, you can't just check in with someone and then you ask them, how are you feeling? And you're going to hear the F word. People are going to say fine. And we know that, sometimes we say that even when we aren't fine. So I would, encourage supervisors, check in with your family members on a regular basis. Maybe change up the question. Instead of saying, how are you feeling? You can ask them, what are you feeling? Which, if you would have noticed on our slide, is something that we used, because how are you feeling? It's so easy for people to just have a canned response. And when you ask someone how they're feeling, it's like, I need to really think about that for a minute. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about why. We've sort of already kind of gotten into this, why we know that there's some uncertainty. Maybe we dread doing something. Do you want to cover sort of any other examples, Alex, of why we experience anxiety?
Yeah, typically we say that this is associated with situations that are new or novel, uncertain, or ambiguous. So very all-encompassing. And I actually think those three can really fit in with our experience of COVID. It's new and novel, it's uncertain, and it's been very ambiguous as we've navigated through it. And that can fit into so many different things. So yeah, I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but that's at least sort of what we see from a clinical perspective.
Okay, perfect. I'm also wanting to acknowledge some of the scenarios, and there's a question also, or I guess maybe also a statement, through the work that I do around respectful workplaces, where we see anxiety show up is around bullying and disrespectful behaviors. So for some people, going back into the office, where they might have to experience some of these behaviors that they've been able to somewhat avoid, not always. I know that this has still carried on throughout people working remotely. I think there's a conversation around how we might want to deal with or anticipate some of those things. So before we sort of dive into those questions, I would really love for you to address this slide, Alex, and, let's have a discussion on diagnosis. And, although, thank you, Amanda, for giving the disclaimer, like, we're not here to diagnose people. because this is your field of work, Alex, and this was conversation and questions that came up so much out of our last webinar, we absolutely wanted to address it, because the reality is some people are pretty resistant to being formally diagnosed.
Yeah.
And I know, Alex, that you hear some people being relieved when they get diagnosed. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Of course. This is such a big topic. And I know, I mean, even in the field of psychology, clinicians just have a varying array of perspectives and viewpoints. Some people believe in diagnosis, some people don't believe in diagnosis, and there's sort of everything in the middle. And so I really want to be careful, of course, about the conversation that we have. There's an article that I've listed just in the left-hand corner here. It's from British Columbia. And in there, they kind of talk about what's the difference between experiencing anxiety and an anxiety disorder. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on, just using these words that are on our slide too, is I've found a lot of people, and maybe these are the questions you've received, Michelle, a lot of people will say to me, well, I don't have the diagnosis though, or I don't meet the criteria for the diagnosis. So do I actually experience anxiety? Is it actually that bad for me? And one of the things I just want to caution people is the trap of not validating one's own experience because it may not be diagnosable per se, that just because you don't have a formal diagnosis or meet those criterias, you may still experience symptoms that are consistent with anxiety. Another piece too, when you were bringing in the resistance and relief, it's so unique to an individual. Some people, they really, really want to know, taking, the formalized assessments and tests that psychologists can provide, they want to have an answer. And for other people, they share, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is I experience these symptoms. Can you help me with that? And let's move forward in that regard. So there's not to be shame or stigma on wherever you fall in that spectrum. It's really about what works for you and what is best for you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's why we sort of started with this awareness, like knowing how you're feeling and just being able to acknowledge it. Ideally, many of us work in a workplace where we can talk about it. And I do want to acknowledge that not everybody does that. I mean, the three of us, when we practice and spend time talking about topics, we've gotten to know each other pretty well. And there have been really tough conversations that we've had. I want to just acknowledge, Alex, a couple comments in the chat. Wow. Shane really hit home for me with his comment to everyone where he says, pressure to perform at work can cause anxiety. I have heard this so much in the last few weeks, because we, even just as a family and in preparation for this webinar, we're talking and saying, like, what are some of the things that are, causing people anxiety right now? I have someone who's destined to graduate this year. And, my other kid was the COVID grad who didn't get a grad. So I'm not going to lie, that sits in the back of our head. We're planning for graduation, but again, we kind of have a plan B if things change. Depends on the unknown, if it's big or small. Yes, completely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I would love to address some of the questions. So prior to us logging in, some people had sent us some questions, and these are some of the ones that we got. So we encourage questions throughout, as Amanda had mentioned. But one of the big ones, and I'm pretty sure we addressed this last time, but because we have some new listeners, I just want to know, Alex, can we get rid of anxiety? Like, is it possible that we have a life without anxiety?
Well, I'm going to be a bit of a devil's advocate here. Can we live a life without happiness, without sadness, without anger? A lot of people, though, not to joke, of course, about that question, a lot of people come in and want their anxiety to be gone. And again, it goes back to that example of walking through the woods that I shared at the beginning. That uncomfortable level, absolutely, we can try to work on and mitigate, but we don't want your anxiety to go away. It can be helpful at times. Yeah.
You know what? And I don't think at all that you're making fun of it. I think that is actually a really great comparison to be able to say that, we are going to live with feelings that might give us a negative feeling or that might be hard to deal with, as much as we're going to have happy feelings. So this is an excellent question, and I think it's an important consideration. I love that comparison. All right. Are there common situations that we know create anxiety in people? Is this a question that you get, Alex? And I guess, how would you address it?
Yeah, well, we've kind of been talking about this a lot throughout our webinar today, and I know people have been so great in being vulnerable and sharing their experiences.
Yeah.
I guess common ones that come to mind for sure: test taking, performance, and that kind of can fall into even like performing at work per se. I used to competitively Irish dance, I guess, St. Patrick's Day today. And so, yeah, every time I had done it for 20 years, but every single time that I would get up to perform, I would always feel that like positive rush of anxiety that would help my adrenaline, And so performing, absolutely. I'm trying to think of other situations, very tense, difficult conversations. Lots of people will share that they're experiencing anxiety going into a conversation with a boss or maybe a loved one that is more conflict related. Yeah. What about in your experience, Michelle, on the work side of things?
Okay, so definitely the conflict. In fact, I was just checking my bookcase to see the book that I've recommended to so many people by Dr. Paul Marciano. It's called Let's Talk About It. I'll put it in the chat. It is an opportunity to really reflect on conversations, and the book is absolutely filled with examples. So instead of just giving you theory about how to have some of these challenging conversations, right? It reframes your mind to say, these are courageous conversations. These are conversations that we're going to have all the time. And to try and alleviate some of the stress and anxiety that people feel, the book is just filled with case studies and examples of conversations you might experience in the workplace and at home. So it's a really great book. So I agree, that one. And also there's a comment in the chat, which I think more people are feeling now, is just social anxiety. Right. And I'm going to describe what I had this week, right? I have a couple of events that I could have attended, large group, and I've kind of said, you know what? I don't think so. There's people I don't know. And in order to keep myself and my family safe prior to traveling, I think I've developed a bit of social anxiety where I've just said, hey, I'm not going to attend these events because I'm not going to feel good when I go. Mm-hmm. So I think that acknowledgement of social anxiety is something we're hearing more and more.
That's a great one. And I think too, a lot of people might be going into this summer and this season with things opening up, comparing their abilities to prior to COVID. Yeah. And you might start, I used to go to social events every day in the work week. That networking was my job. Why is it a little more difficult or draining for me now? And just even those switches to be mindful of. I'm so appreciative that you brought that up, Michelle, and that was in the chat box too.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks for sharing the book, Amanda. I recommend it. It's a great book. Okay, there's a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to give you a minute to think about this one, Alex. What's happening in our brain when anxiety shows up? There's lots of chemical interactions. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Goodness.
As a dog owner and someone who starts every morning releasing all of the positive chemicals by giving my dog rubs, I think this is a good question for people because we want to talk, that's a strategy, right? Part of understanding what's happening in our brain can help us develop some strategies for dealing with anxiety.
You know what's so hilarious? I just got a boost of anxiety as you asked me that question because I kind of realized I don't have like a neuroscience background. I don't have actually maybe the best, most reliable answer on what's going on in our brains when anxiety is happening. So I encourage actually on YouTube there or on Google Images, there's lots and lots of great resources to see just the interactions in our brains from a hormonal level, the balances, the limbic system, which is sort of the emotion center of our brain. So I encourage everyone to kind of go and look on that. It's funny, I'll often say to clients, I wish I was a neuroscientist and I had more of a detailed answer for you here.
Yeah, and you know what? There is a really great podcast that I listen to, and I've referenced it before. It's called The Science of Happiness. and it is based on research. So that's a great lead in to one of the other questions that we got asked, Alex. How do I know what sources to trust on the internet around mental health? So on Instagram, I follow a ton of people that are offering sort of mental health insights, mental health advice. Can you give us some guidance on that one?
Absolutely. It's a little bit of like a double-edged sword, because a part of me, I follow some of those accounts too, and I think we can feel so I don't know if I want to say welcomed, but included in communities. You know, you're reading these things and you're seeing comments from other people. Wow, it's not just me who's experienced this. And even I have a lot of people coming in and saying, oh, I actually came here because of a TikTok video that I saw where someone was maybe describing their anxiety experience. And it made me think, oh, maybe there's something going on with me. And so I guess maybe the best way to put it is sort of holding these things loosely. Everything has its place, of course. There can be tests online. There can be bad advice online too. And so just being, I guess, a little bit cautious, using that critical thinking of, you know, what is this telling me or advising me to do? Is it more just a shared experience that someone is giving, which is always great to read into? Yeah. So kind of like gray area. What are your thoughts on that, Michelle?
I like research-based evidence personally. So there's a few I guess, you know, people who have a science background that resonates with me. And maybe what we'll do, I see there's a comment about not being able to copy the pieces in the chat. Maybe what we'll do is share some of the sources, Alex, that we've used, even not just in this webinar, but in other webinars, in terms of a reliable source, because you know, I love the fact that people do share openly on social media their experience, but I do think that when we're looking at suggestions and strategies, absolutely, we want to use reliable, evidence-based information, which is why, you know, we're always recommending that people visit doctors. Right? When we're having these conversations, I mean, we're trying to provide some overall strategies, but that's always, you know, going to a health provider is going to be one of the best places for you to start individually.
The place for all these different medias and resources, but I totally agree. There's something to be said about going to the professionals, getting some input on that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so before, you know, you can still put your questions in. We absolutely will share those resources in a follow-up email. Tell me, let's just sort of end, Alex, with some ideas about suggestions in terms of if we're experiencing the feelings that people had been putting in the slides, or if they're in a situation or going to be in a situation where they know it might cause some anxiety. Can we give people some steps, some just really practical strategies on what they can do now that they've understood their anxiety, how they might be able to deal with it?
Absolutely. That is such a good question. I don't know why this just came to mind. Maybe it's because I have a coffee mug here. Limiting caffeine, you'd be surprised as to if you're already sort of prone to experiencing anxiety, limiting your caffeine intake can make a huge difference for people. And I know that's a very small step, but that's definitely something I encourage. Noticing too, you know, if you take a lens at your week coming up, how much time do you have scheduled for yourself or for life-giving activities, you know, walking now that things are better, maybe you practice yoga, but definitely exercise, as I imagine everyone has seen, you know, in research articles. Speaking of that, exercise is such an important addition to that. Just even talking about that preparation, I think there can be too much preparation that can almost increase anxiety, not enough preparation that can also make you feel anxious. Just kind of, as you're saying, maybe you're going to a barbecue, you're feeling a little nervous of what it might be like now that COVID's over. Getting a good lens of the support network that's going to be there with you. Also, I've found this can be helpful for individuals if you start to feel anxiety in a moment, whether it's during a test taking or at a social event, almost coming up with a bit of a plan for what will you do in that moment to meet yourself. For some people, breathing techniques work wonders. For others, grounding techniques are a little better, or taking a little walk, taking a break, leaving your office kind of thing. So just really knowing yourself and playing around with the different strategies that are out there online, different strategies that work for your friends or that your therapist have shared. That's sort of the best way. I guess I've been very general in sort of what I've shared. There's so many ways to navigate it, and it's very unique to the person and what works for them.
Alex, can you give us an example of a grounding technique? I was part of an entrepreneur's webinar last week, and we were talking about these strategies, and someone was saying, I think it's fairly easy for us to relate or to research a breathing exercise. Even we just know, taking deep breaths, but can you share maybe what a grounding exercise might be? That some people might not be familiar with that.
Oh, good question. Essentially, what I like about grounding exercises is they ask you to move into your senses. So one thing people might take away is strategies that encourage you to move into the five senses can be very grounding and take you out of that emotion center.
Yes.
So a lot of people are familiar, and this is my favorite, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yes.
Nodding because you've heard of it.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I even wonder, I don't know, we could kind of play around. We have a minute. I could lead us through a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We could do it together. What do you think about that, Michelle?
I love the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 because this one, in my opinion, is something you can also do, with people at work, but you can also do it like with a 5-year-old. I think this is a brilliant strategy.
I love this one. To give some background before we kind of go through it, I'll ask you I guess we can't really name, so you can say these things to yourself, notice them to yourself. 5 things that you see around you. Don't forget to look all the way around your physical space. 5 things that you see, 4 things that you feel. We don't mean feeling as in terms of emotion, but the tactile sense. Your socks on your feet. Yes, the hair on the back of your neck. Can you pick something up? 3 things that you hear, 2 things that you smell. If you can't smell anything, I always say 2 smells that you enjoy, and 1 thing that you taste, or something that you enjoy that you taste. So just get people to just take a seat, get comfy in your chair. Always good to take a couple breaths in just before you enter into that practice. In and out. Now, I'd like you to notice 5 things that you see. Four things that you feel. Maybe rub, really get a sense of the different textures. This one's my favorite. 3 things that you can hear. Maybe you have to hear beyond the walls of the room that you're in and out.
That's the first thing I heard.
2 things that you smell, or 2 smells that you enjoy. Think of those. And 1 thing that you can taste, or a taste that you enjoy.
By the time we get to this point in this exercise, Alex, I can always literally taste the chocolate. I can always taste it in my mouth. It's so funny. So sometimes I use this exercise too when I think I want a piece of chocolate, and I go, well, do I want a piece of chocolate, or am I just bored? And I can walk myself through that, and I get that sensation where my body's like, oh, I just needed to know what it was like. So I appreciate that. Hopefully you can write that down and use it. There's a question that I think leads really well, sort of as a follow-up in the chat, about a good way to support others around you that we know are struggling with and perhaps experience anxiety. Can we address that?
Oh, I love that question. I can
Yeah,
really
me too.
see compassion and understanding in that.
Yeah, me too.
The first thing that kind of comes to mind when I think about supporting others is practicing patience and grace. I think, as a parent or as a friend, colleague, you can get frustrated when you notice someone's anxiety is around a lot, or maybe they're experiencing irrational thoughts. So the thing that's maybe not helpful to say to people is, I just don't think that way, or that's such an irrational thought. Like, why would you even think the what ifs?
Yeah, why are you worried about that?
Yeah, there's nothing to be worried about.
Yeah.
I think trying to be as validating and supportive as possible, even if you have a hard time understanding where that person is coming from or what's going on for them, is huge. As well too, depending on the relationship that you have, starting conversations about how you're feeling, how they're feeling, like bringing those conversations up to really encourage that sense of community and to show people around you your openness to supporting them when they're struggling. That is huge. Social support and the connections that we experience with our family and friends can be so healing and can really make such a big difference in people's lives.
And part of the conversation that we had recently in another webinar about wellness was just that sense of community. So acknowledging that, just because you're in the workplace doesn't mean that needs to be where you get support at the moment. It doesn't need to necessarily come from your family. These are all areas and different communities in our lives. But if you're experiencing some feelings related to anxiety at work, maybe you can, as you mentioned earlier, you can phone a friend, or, you can step outside and get some fresh air. Like, I think just acknowledging where your support comes from. One of the things that I'll share is, when I was experiencing lots of challenges with my mom's health in the fall, I acknowledged through conversation with my therapist that one of my friends is my social support in that setting. She was always uplifting. She was always encouraging. And so I would call her, not even recognizing that she was my sort of safety net. And so my next call right after that conversation with my therapist was, hey, you're my safety net. And I just want to acknowledge that. I want to say thanks. Right? Because it was just sort of that disconnection from that moment that really helped me get through what I was feeling. And I was not even aware of it, even though I called her religiously after these intensely emotional moments for me. So I just think the acknowledgement and the recognition is hugely important. There's a great question in the chat. It just came to us, so I do want to address it. Is it okay with a friend to ask, what they might be afraid of in terms of what's happening, and then trying to walk them through whether those things could actually happen? Because I think this really relates to the empathy that we have with people. Do I want to share with the individual, obviously in a caring and compassionate way, that may or may not happen? The question is, will that process increase their anxiety, or will I help them work through it and help them recognize, hey, yeah, maybe there's a low chance that could happen? Do you have any thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a place to be curious about what is going on for that person, why they're feeling anxious about it, to get a good understanding of what that situation or that trigger that's increasing their anxiety, what that means for them. Okay. One thing I would caution in moving through those steps of the likelihood of those things happening is actually a lot of people who experience anxiety will say to me, I know this is irrational. I know that, I've walked through the likelihood. There's a very small chance this could happen, but the feeling is still there. So, of course, depending on reading the situation with that person and your relationship to them, being curious absolutely has a place, but being careful about is walking them through those steps going to invalidate or dismiss their experience of anxiety? Sort of my thoughts on that.
Okay. So that really addresses sort of dealing with, we've talked about planning for the feelings and emotions, and we've talked about sort of some scenarios where you might deal with it. Can you just sort of now, as we close off on the webinar, talk about, so maybe we have or haven't made that awareness before the situation. What about after? So now we've passed through, right? I've gotten on the plane safely, or I've gone to the social event safely, and I've come home, or I've dealt with this thing at work. Can you walk me through one last thing that we might be able to do if, we just weren't in that proactive mode?
Yeah, I think that reflecting is so important. Even my first couple webinars that I did, where I was feeling quite anxious doing them, I'd look back after it was done. Okay, what was going on there for me? Of course, it's normal to experience that anxiety, but what could I have done leading? Did I prepare enough? Should I have told Michelle and Amanda that I was a little nervous and gained support through them? Just being reflective in that way can be such a powerful tool to get to know yourself, understanding your own triggers, what it looks like for you, that kind of thing. I don't know if that's a good answer for your question, but that's what came to mind.
No, that's exactly where I was going, because I think sometimes we miss the debrief. So in my line of work, we call that a debrief, right? That's an opportunity to reflect on what happened, how I felt. When I'm working with people for presentation skills, and a lot of people do deal with that nervousness, we always get them to sort of do a sandwich approach and say, hey, first thing you want to think of after this presentation is what went well. So, right, think about that from your experience in terms of dealing with anxiety. What went well? Is there one thing that, I didn't anticipate, or that I did anticipate that went well? And then what did I struggle with? So what was one of the things that, as you were saying, I might want to do differently, or I could do differently next time? And then I encourage people to write that down. So, whether it's a presentation skills journal or it's a feelings journal, I know you're going to hear this. I have a gratitude app, as many of you know, and it's just an opportunity to sort of sit and reflect, which is what we hope you'll do as a result of this webinar. We put the feedback link, and it will come to you as soon as you log out, but we know that some of you are going to step right into your next meeting or do something. We hope you take a couple of minutes for yourself. So please know that we really appreciate your honest feedback as we go through, and that this group is really a collaborative effort. We are so delighted at Creating People Power to be collaborating with Cornerstone Counseling. We've been doing this for a few years now, and we've added to our network. We also have Vive Mental Health as part of our network. That's Christopher Marks, who has a podcast on mental health, and we have a newsletter collaboratively that we work on together with Cornerstone, also with Brandy Payne, who, like Chris and I, are certified psychological health and safety advisors. So with this community of 4 companies that include Cornerstone, we really just want to bring mental health strategies and sort of conversation to not just your personal lives, but also your professional lives. So having said that, Cornerstone has a couple of workshops coming up. I think today is actually the beginning of marriage preparation. So today, tomorrow, and Saturday. The next one is in May. I love these courses. I did this myself 27 years ago, and marriage prep is a huge part of just having conversation. And then if you're interested, they also host workshops on anger management. So there's some coming up in April and in May, as you can see, and we will send this information out to everyone. And Creating People Power, we're hosting a webinar in conjunction with the Edmonton Construction Association on April 5th. This is a bit of a mini workshop, so we will be in meeting format for that one. And it'll give people from a construction and industrial standpoint an opportunity to really talk about mental health. Chris has a background in construction, and he'll be co-hosting that event with me. And finally, the 4 of us are collaborating on a workshop virtually April 13th. So from the safety and comfort of your home, no matter where you are. We've been hearing a lot about burnout. We hosted a webinar on this topic, Alex and I, in December. And as a result of that and conversations we've had with many clients, we are going to host a half-day workshop on making sure that you check in before you check out. So some strategies in terms of preventing burnout, dealing with it if you're already there. And we do have a not-for-profit rate. So if you're a not-for-profit, please reach out to myself or Amanda at Cornerstone Counseling to get a discount code. Having said that, Alex, do you have any final words that we want to leave people with? I want to thank everybody for joining us. First of all, thanks for being here, everyone. I know we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but we'll send some resources as a follow-up. Final words, Alex?
I just thank you. I always love the discussion component. And especially people, it takes a lot of courage and vulnerability to share in the chat, but that's what makes these workshops so much more fruitful, and just even the questions that have come out of it. So I'm just so grateful for that. And thank you, Michelle and Amanda, for being so wonderful to work on with these webinars.
Yeah, I concur. Thanks everybody for logging in. It was so nice to have so many people join us today. Absolutely wonderful. And we really appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty. So take care, everyone. Have a happy St. Patrick's Day and get outside. Enjoy that sunshine. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.